let's get this show on the road. I mean, so I think one other person. So yeah, so we wanted to put together this webinar just as a time to kind of talk about, green buying trends and production planning as, things are going on with coronavirus, and how much planning needs to be done just in terms of, managing what is currently in your inventory, as well as, making sure that you get that coffee ready for your filter for next season, and planning everything in between. So we wanted to put together something just as a good mix of, helpful content as well as question and answers. So part of that will be, if you have any questions throughout this entire webinar, feel free to shoot them in the chat, and we'll put all those together. And at the very end, we'll go back kind of through those, and we can reference anything that we kind of brought up along the way. And then if there anything else that comes up in the meantime, we'll try and bring that up. And then, yeah, we'll kind of get going and talk about how Condesa, or how like importing and green buying and Cropster kind of comes together to help with you guys' green buying and production planning. Oliver, you want to get us kicked off?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to say, yeah, look, obviously we've got a bit of a plan on what we're talking about with the market trends, challenges ahead. But please, as I can see, the chat's flashing up. Very happy to answer, any questions midway through as well. I don't want it to be, Ollie and Matt just diatribing. So, yeah, happy to answer as we go along, particularly if there's anything that people flag. But yeah, I think a big part of what the year's been is you can't get away from the very large elephant in the room that's COVID-19. And it really has had a massive effect on everything, especially coffee. And I think if there's one thing that we can take as a constant, or that we can guarantee on during these COVID times, is that, constant change, constant flux. And, it's been a real challenge as a green importer, someone who's been trying to help our customers to sort of manage that and sort of work out where we're going and where we've come from. And I think it's been so important to be able to sort of pivot, and it's been so important to have our finger on the pulse in terms of what our customers are doing. So, as part of that, I really do think that obviously COVID-19's completely changed the Aussie coffee scene, at least. It's completely changed the way that roasters are behaving. It's completely changed the models that importers are using, and it's completely changed, origin and production. Whether that's all for the negative, I don't necessarily know. I think there have been some positives. The fact that we're doing this is a big one, and yeah, I think that there has obviously been some massive negative, but I think there's been some huge positive, and I'll sort of go into that as we go through. But first and foremost, the way that the consumers have been consuming coffee has been a massive, step change. And we've really seen people traditionally being in the CBDs, working in the city centres, getting their mid-morning coffee, or getting their commuter coffee, having a long lunch, getting their coffee during lunch, and not really consuming coffee in those chunks of time between. The habits of the consumer have completely changed the face of how roasters and us importers are having to manage that. And the reason being is that, you know, everyone's now buying online. They're buying at the supermarkets, and you know, they're consuming at home. You know, they are also consuming takeaway, and I've seen people getting their Uber takeout, and that's meant that, you know, if we go one step back up the chain, roasters are having to change the way in which they roast, and you know, a lot of models where we've traditionally seen the coffee shop model serving the long breakfast, coffee shop model where perhaps the profits are made during the food as well as the coffee. Our customers and roasters have had to pivot the way that they now, you know, do that. You know, there can't be that same sort of profit margin around the food. So, you know, they've got to look to the coffee to pick that up. They've got to engage the consumer in new ways. One of the trends that we've seen was that the CBDs, you know, have dropped away, particularly in the East Coast and SA. On the West Coast, not so much. But even then, you've seen sort of the CBD stores, really picking up, and the suburban stores really picking up, and some customers have never had such records in those suburban stores. So it's really interesting to sort of see that change from location. You know, coffee stores that were very quiet in the suburbs suddenly find themselves really busy as people working from home, you know, take advantage of that. And again, I don't think there's a single Aussie roaster, at least, who's not found that going online has been, you know, the way forward. I think you guys did the amazing online store option as well, Matt. Sort of help roasters. And I think that's, go on.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I mean, just with shipped beans, there's so many people who like hadn't set up an online web store yet. So we created Ships Beans just as it was basically a pre-made WooCommerce platform. And so, I mean, with so many people trying to figure out, you know, how do I sell my coffee when you can't sell it in the store because I mean, everything's shut down. It was kind of interesting to see, you know, how many people hadn't needed to move towards online yet. And I think that just kind of shows how much that is impacting the coffee industry, and that movement towards online, where there's such as value for being brick and mortar and serving coffee in person, because, you know, there's just nothing matches that. But this kind of need to figure out, you know, how do we create new sales, or how do we create new supply chains and new sales channels where we didn't have to have those before. So it's just interesting. It's interesting to see that pivot happening.
Yeah, totally. And you know, like, everyone's been doing it. You know, you know, the sort of reevaluating the channels. You know, whereas it might have been just one channel, now they've realised. You know, and you know, that goes across, you know, all the chain. You know, everyone's realised, well, I've got to have multiple channels in order to, you know, keep myself my head above water. But yeah, it's been really interesting sort of seeing that diversification, and then because you were getting the move away from some channels for the roasters. So, for example, you weren't doing your in-shop coffee store, but you know what, you picked up a massive online a massive online increase, and perhaps you found a foot into the supermarket channel, which I think for us has been huge. We've seen, because the consumer's been consuming at home, the obvious place to get their coffee is the supermarket. Because of that, the supermarkets have responded and are providing a lot more of those 250 bag, 320 bag, whatever it is, sort of small serves. and the consumers doing it at home, which means that lots more roasters are suddenly getting a line in the supermarket, which again has that knock-on effect to us importers. And then, yeah, from the import perspective, you know, COVID's had a huge effect on not just us, but, you know, I can see, you know, all of our competitors, and we've all, you know, really been affected by it, obviously. I think we at Condesa have been very lucky because we've had multiple purchase options at origin, multiple sister companies working for us on the ground there. We've been able to sort of be nimble, and for example, and I'll go into this a little bit more, you know, Colombia's been massively affected, but that's okay for us because we have been able to pivot to another origin that perhaps hasn't been affected as much. And, you know, that we've been so fortunate that that's the case. And, you know, I know that, you know, some of the other importers into Australia haven't had that opportunity. Like, you know, their success has always been that focus, you know, like, you know, they focused on Colombia, they focused on, you know, Ethiopia or one or two. And so, you know, those companies have found that harder. And so, you know, it has changed the options for consumers and roasters.
Luke Terry mentioned in the chat that he did a just-in-time model for purchasing, you know, is becoming more and more difficult, kind of as we've been talking about, and as we're going to be talking about. It's hard to just like find good specialty coffee in the warehouse, and so for this optimization of supply chain, figuring out, you know, we've had to move towards these kind of we can't just, you know, be as nimble and as flexible as we used to be. So figuring out how do we you know, move towards purchasing and planning that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. I think the whole, you know, as I make the point in the slide there, you know, spot or not, I think there had been a trend of like a slow trend away from importers having spot coffee always on hand, and COVID really has stressed that, you know, the stress test on having spot coffee, and I think you know, it showed like that is a real weakness. You know, spot coffee that you have on sale is a massive risk, basically. You know, yes, it's great to have it there because without it, you can't make those sales. But if you can't sell it, then it's, you know, it burns away any profit you might have made, and then some. So it is this big sort of spot coffee. It's always this risk management issue, and you know, we saw it with our roasters, and you know, again, we've seen it with, so, you know, other importers. A lot of them have just decided not to bring their spot in that they usually would. Sometimes that's because it wasn't available at origin, and sometimes because they didn't know if their roasters were going to buy it. And you know, you've got this situation where, and we do it, like we would bring in, let's say, a box of mixed lots, but we'd always do that knowing that like a certain amount of those lots already had a home, and you wouldn't want to bring in like a full mixed box if you didn't have a home. Now suddenly you've got, you know, some of those roasters deciding not to buy, you're not then going to bring in the full container. So, you know, it's been interesting because very few importers have got a spot position at the moment. And yeah, and it's been moving that way anyway. Like I think,
does that mean you can't offer spot as often to your customers? Like how much like spot would you say you have available these days?
Yeah, I mean, we made a punt at the time COVID hit. We decided that we were going to ship anyway. Okay. I was in Ethiopia and Kenya when you were getting those first cases out of Wuhan, and
Mm-hmm.
we were starting to wonder, look, should we do this, should we not? And Stephen and I, our director at the time, was like, look, let's just pull the trigger, let's do this, and I hope it's the right decision.
Mm-hmm.
And we were very lucky that we did do it because, particularly all of our Kenyan and Ethiopian has sold out now, and Colombian as well. But on the other hand, we have some of that left, but we didn't do some of the origins that sell in less volume. So, for example, we didn't do Guatemala this year. We did Mexico, but in less volume.
Mm-hmm.
So we did Costa Rica because we love Costa Rica. We didn't do micro lots for Honduras. So yeah, we don't have the same big range. And the big pivot for us was only moving it if we got a back-to-back sale. And that's the way we've been moving. Like, we would prefer the build up a relationship with the roaster so that they have confidence in our network, and then through that confidence they're happy to go and use the network to go and fill their boots and buy whatever coffee they like from whatever origin they like. For us, we'd much prefer that model because it's the short cash to cash cycle. You've got it in, you've got it and you've sold it before you've even shipped it. It's got a home. There's not much risk. So that's always been the ideal model. And now it's more and more leaning that way. Particularly, and again, I'll go into this, particularly, coming into 2021 and, the new year and seeing what that looks like.
Do you want to move on to green buying now?
Yeah, go on then.
Yeah, perfect.
So yeah, green buying is obviously, like I said, massively changed. I think in terms of just like where the market's at, it's in a quite interesting position. Coffee is still ultimately cheap at the moment. We've still seen, we've just had a very big Brazil crop. Brazil is still selling, and although the C market price today, I think, is 121.65 thereabouts. Although it's come up a little bit from the last sort of the last month or so when it was nearer the dollar, it's still very reasonably priced. And it's interesting to see that for the last 5 to 6 years, the coffee price has been dropping, sort of almost year on year. It's sort of been trending down. And what COVID has sort of done is maybe, and again, it's hard, like, it's very hard to say, like, we like weathermen trying to work out what the weather's going to be next week. But, it's starting to trend back up in price. And with the challenges of what's happening in Central America, the challenges of what's happening in America, and the effects that's had on the USD, it's and that's sort of having ramifications across the board. In Australia, the Aussie dollar has strengthened against the US, so that means your micro lots are a little bit cheaper. You get a little bit more bang for your buck. And if the Aussie, the US dollar's weakening, it's a good time to buy coffee. But as a C market, so for your blending quality, it's slightly more expensive than it has been. And it's going to be interesting with all these companies that have sort of, I guess, started in a downward trend. Is that, are they going to be able to manage for the future?
Yeah.
And I think that's a key question. You know, every roaster has to ask themselves. That's a
Mm-hmm.
key question we have to ask ourselves. Are we supporting our roasters and helping them in that? And you know, it's going to be a really big challenge for the market. I think with the fact that a lot of the roasters, because they've had to diversify what they're offering, again, perhaps margins, you know, and again, supermarkets, we all know, push you for your price, your very, 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 very best price. I think, you know, a lot of roasters are having to look at, you know, where their bottom line is. And you know, that sort of projected planning, that forward planning will, you know, will be so crucial for the purchase price to make sure you're buying at the right time. And you're aware of, you know, again, I think so many specialty roasters haven't been that worried about the C market. But I, you know, particularly as it's been dropping, but I think it's something that we as specialty roasters and importers really have to educate people a bit more about, because as the market starts to pop up a bit, you know, it will be something that everyone needs to be aware of when they're buying their coffee. You know, like even knowing when, you know, on the odd day that it does drop away quickly, I'm going to book some coffee for, you know, for the next 3 months ahead, the next 6 months ahead.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to be really important to sort of, you know, factor that in. So just to sort of give a bit of an insight into green buying and COVID. Again, I don't think there's a single origin that hasn't been affected by it. And I think, you know, starting with Colombia, for example, it was really interesting to see Colombia as an origin versus Central America. Colombia, so Colombia started their crop during COVID, whereas Central America had finished their crop as COVID started. And, you know, you had two very different responses. Colombia literally didn't, you know, in Colombia, there was lockdown. People haven't been moving, even in internal borders. They've been very responsible about their response to COVID-19. You know, I know our offices haven't been able to meet our partners in the field as much. There's been lots of meetings like this one with partners, and it's been a real challenge to get pickers out to the farms to pick. You know, your average Colombian farm is relatively small. You know, it's often done family, like a small family does the buying. And, you know, they also, the small family does the picking, and they also rely on local pickers. But if you can't move around, then you can't help pick the coffee. So the price of Colombian coffee has been really high in order to sort of meet those demands. You know, plus the Colombian peso has been very strong. So it means that the cost of buying, you know, your Colombian coffee has been much higher. What that means to us and to our producers is the cost of Colombian coffee has been much higher. And whereas last year you might have comfortably got a sort of base rate Excelsior coffee at $6. Now that coffee might be almost $1 more, maybe even more than that. And whereas you might have got a high-end blender at $9, you're not going to get a high-end blender unless you spend $11. And if you want a micro lot, whereas it might have been 12, it's now going to be 13, 14. So it's had a really big effect in Colombia. And because of that, whereas, you know, and let's face it, most roasters here are using Colombian coffee as part of their blend. So versatile, and you get it year on year. You know, throughout the year, what are roasters going to be doing for you know, the rest of 2020 and 2021?
Yeah, I was just about to ask, have you seen roasters pivoting to other origins or working on different types of, contracts with Colombian coffee to make sure that they have it available to keep their offerings the same?
Yeah, there's been exactly that. There's been sort of a couple of different strategies. One of which is taking sort of their Colombians in small tranches so that they're not paying as much on carry, for example, which obviously leaves them open to not necessarily being able to get everything they want, but at least they're covering their risk. So that's one way people have done it. And the other is to switch origins. So we've seen a number of people sort of looking around at, for example, high-end blenders from Honduras. Has been ones. People have, some people have been using Mexicans as blender options to give that like caramel toffee chocolate profile. So yeah, we have seen that definitely, and again, you've got sort of two crops. So again, the prices are very high for coffee that's going to be arriving in October, November, and people are considering using Uganda, for example, Rwanda, for example, Burundi as alternatives for sort of something that will give similar profile. But it's hard because Colombia is rather unique. It's got that, the plum, the big sort of plummy stewed fruit texture. It's got the caramels and the toffee. There are not that many coffees that hold a similar profile. Maybe Tanzania, maybe Uganda. Like, it's not exactly something you can just switch to. So it'll be interesting, and I think that's one of the big question marks. We just don't know. We don't know where it's going to go. So it's going to be interesting to watch. Brazil has also been interesting. Brazil's, like Colombia, has had its crop through COVID-19. I think they've, obviously not had perhaps the best president in the world when it comes to his views on COVID-19. No finger pointing here. So I think, they've really struggled with sort of keeping COVID-19 cases down. But at the same time, because, there hasn't been the massive lockdowns, with the correct procedures in place, I think they've been able to manage. And Brazil have also been very lucky in a sense because a lot of their production's mechanized. So literally the guy, it requires a guy driving the sort of the massive picker that straddles the trees, a guy driving the tractor next to him, and maybe a spotter, watching what's going on. And so like three guys can pick a, farm the size of a small county, a small state, in an afternoon without having too many issues with, sort of being COVID unsafe. And I do know from our partners' experience, everyone's being super careful about it, despite what, President Bolsonaro has been saying. I think everyone realizes it's an issue, but Brazil has sort of carried on, pretty well. And, it's been a big crop, and it's a big crop, and it's part of the reason why the coffee price is still good.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say, have you noticed anything about the quality of Brazil this year? I mean, is it something that maybe you could use as a larger portion of your blend, or is it, is it just Brazil as always? Is it something that people should be looking out for?
Yeah, I mean, look, Brazil, the quality has been solid this year. One of the things actually we've seen is, and again, this sort of partly connects up to Central America and Honduras specifically. One of the biggest producers of washed miles, which a lot of larger scale roasters use as the backstay of their blend. So that there's that sort of chocolate, toffee, nut, SHB quality, and you'd see them coming out of mainly Nicaragua and Honduras mainly is the big one. And, you know, traditionally that's where you go for your wash miles. But because the quality is so much better out of Brazil this year, because they've been largely unaffected, they are starting to take some of that market. And people are looking at Brazil to be the possible, you know, place for that style of coffee. So I definitely think, you know, that there has been, you know, more people taking, you know, having attention in Brazil. And I think the other big thing is people are looking to Brazil as, you know, it's not just the chocolate nutty profile that I think traditionally Brazil's been associated with. And of course, we've seen that already, you know, Capricornio, Carmo, Bourbon, which are our sister companies, all sort of doing specialty lines. But, you know, Brazil's now better placed than ever to really take advantage of that and sort of push the envelope on interesting processing, interesting sort of scientific, you know, they're really sort of, you know, reaching out for all opportunity in Brazil. And it's such a vast country. There's so many different flavor profiles you can get out. I think people will be looking and are looking, you know, much more closely at Brazil for that, you know, for that very reason. So yeah, again, it's going to be interesting to see. The other one, as I said, sort of touched on briefly, Central America has, you know, really so far kind of, it's been out in the news a little bit because it had finished its crop before COVID-19. I think most of the centrals had shipped. And what's going to be interesting now, as I touched on, Honduras certainly has been affected. El Salvador, Costa Rica, you know, Nicaragua, they, you know, and Guad, they're all going to be massively affected by the pickers, because the pickers have generally been transitory. So, you know, they'll start at the top and work all the way down through Central America. But that's not going to happen this year.
Interesting.
And that's going to have a ramification on price, because you're going to have to pay a high price to get your picker to pick, which is going to have a knock-on effect of the price at which it's sold to, you know, the exporters and the importers. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with Central America. Will they be able to spray the trees with leaf rust? Will they be able to give the, like, you know, the same agronomical inputs that you know, traditionally they've been able to do? It's a very big question mark, you know, for Central America. It's going to be very interesting to see. And again, it might cause this pivot, you know, towards other origins. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting one. But yeah, we've been lucky in that we've sort of had a good connection so far with all our partners. But, you know, again, it'll be really interesting to watch. And then sort of lastly, coming into Africa, you know, again, Kenya and Ethiopia and Uganda had already done their crops before COVID-19 hit. And I think, again, there's been quite a lot of underreporting there. I think the cases of COVID-19 are pretty low in comparison to the rest of the world. But I think there's no doubt about it. There have been lots of unreported cases in you know, most countries in Africa. You know, and again, it's going to be fascinating to see how they manage those challenges. Really, I was talking to Muki, one of our team who's over there during the first wave, and she was saying how, you know, people in Kenya, and I know definitely the same case in Ethiopia, Burundi, Rwanda, they don't have an opportunity to go, I'm not going into work today. You know, they don't have an opportunity to go, I'll work from home, because there's no network. So, you know, they don't have an opportunity to get sick pay because there's nothing. So if they want money, if they want food for their table, they've got to go to work. You know, so it's been, and it will have a massive effect on, you know, I think every producing country. You know, the cases are probably underreported, and I think there is more COVID-19 in Africa than they're saying there is. And I think, you know, although they've just got on with it and kept sort of doing the inputs that they need to, again, I think we're going to see what comes out in the wash, you know, by November. And it is quite sobering.
Yeah. Well, so then my question, and I think this will kind of tie into the next point that you have. If, as a roaster, what would you be thinking in terms of like planning your offering, and if knowing what you've kind of talked about, like not as much spot offerings available, as well as the, you know, things that are going on, and like, will there be a Colombia crop, and, you know, say my espresso is 60% Colombia. What would you say you need to be thinking about as a roaster in terms of moving into the next part of, you know, living with the ramifications of COVID? So, you know, say pickers don't come through, and say there's a huge bout of COVID cases in Africa and some things shut down. What's the best way to, you know, kind of plan that going forward?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the more commercially minded roasters do it anyway, which is forward plan. I think we as a specialty scene are not very good at forward planning and forecasting. Some of us are better than others. And I think that's going to be your big key, you know, strategy for the rest of 2020 and into 21. Forward plan. You know, really carefully think about what you want. Consider those blends where you are using your Colombias, where you are using, you know, your Kenyans, your Africans, and think about think about ways in which you can sort of work around them. And that's not to say these origins aren't going to be available. They are, but are they going to be available in the same volume, and are they going to be available at the same price that you've been used to, will be the big question. So I think no matter if you're big or small, you know, looking at your bottom lines, looking at exactly how much wiggle room you might have in a blend with regards to the cost of blend components, I think is going to be critical. I think, you know, making sure that your relationships are solid, that's going to be critical. It's going to be really hard because how do you forecast in COVID-19 world? But I think you've got to forecast. You've got to do a conservative forecast, because at least if you've done that, then you can probably pick up spot for, you know, the rest of it. You might not be able to spot for all of it, very unlikely. But, you know, if you've at least locked away what you know you would produce in a sort of quiet time, then you can maybe find you know, something for you know, filling that gap. But at least you've got your base done. So definitely, I think that's my biggest piece of advice: forward plan. You know, really look at your consumption numbers, and you know, go from there. You know, that's really key for everyone, because otherwise you're going to be left scrabbling. And I think that's, again, I think for the specialty market, we are still quite used to doing the spot purchase. And I think, you know, it's going to get people to think differently and pivot away from that traditional style, will be really key. I think for importer level as well, like what are the, you know, what's happening there? One thing we've seen is like liquidity, the cost of finance. Like that's been, you know, that's been crazy. And again, no names here, but we had a massive challenge during COVID-19 because one of the groups that we worked with, one of the banks we worked with, just said, "Nope, we're not lending. We're not lending on commodities." So like, see, we were looking around, and we're very lucky. We're part of the bigger entity that's Ecom. So we had their finance facilities, and there were ways we could work around. And we had other relationships with other banks. But I saw a study recently from Europe, which was they were talking to all the big sort of finance houses, the big banking houses that have traditionally lent to commodity importers, exporters, and a lot of them are basically like pulling back from lending. So that's the other thing as a roaster. Make sure that the people you're working with have lines, and also be realistic about building in an extra bit of fat in your current blend cost, because I think as the lending, the cost of lending goes up, then obviously the cost of green will go up because that cost is passed to the roaster. So I definitely think reevaluating that would be key.
Yeah. Well, I think that's where, just kind of thinking about, it's not just, I have this Colombia that's in my blend, but it's like, I have this Colombia, which is this farm, which I know they have a good connection with this exporter, and I know that this exporter will be able to get their coffee out in one of the limited number of crates that are being sent out now. And I know I can, not only is this coffee a part of my blend, but also I know that like the story of this coffee and all the asterisks that are attached that mean that or like what's the actual likelihood of this coffee getting from origin to my roastery, and knowing all that and having an importer that can help you plan out that, I think is just kind of the essential part of what's becoming more important.
Yeah, definitely. And I think those roasters that do, that are talking to their producers, the whole sort of direct trade thing, I think, whether or not you have a direct trade relationship, I think if you're able to talk to your, producers and you can see that face to face, I think you should be trying to do that in every single case. We had, for example, one of our customers up in Queensland. They really wanted to talk to their producers, the guys from the cooperative that were supporting them this year, and it was really cool to be able to make that connection. Like, it was really nice to sort of put them together and everyone could see everyone and know who they were and know where the home of the coffee. But more importantly, it's this thing of like, the producer knows that the roaster is there and waiting for their coffee. And I think that relationship that you can get through an importer is really important. And I think, that's going to be more and more important. Making sure you have access to those kind of networks will be key to make sure that producer who's traditionally always been there, is going to continue to be. So it's fundamental. It's going to be a real big one.
Also, we're most of the way through this at this point. I just want to say, if you have any questions through this, make sure that you're sending those through the chat, and then at the end of this, we'll tackle as many of them as we can. So just a reminder, please send through questions. Okay.
Yeah. So sort of I've kind of touched on this already. I think, what can we expect from 2020 and 2021? We can expect the unexpected. I definitely don't think COVID's going to go away anytime soon, and I think anyone who's listening will agree. So, plan for sort of alternatives. Really make sure that you know, you've got a solid connection with a importing partner. You know, because I certainly am not going to be traveling for the next 6 months at least, realistically. You know, and therefore, how am I going to manage my relationship in Ethiopia, which, you know, Ethiopia is possibly one of the most challenging origins that any importer will, you know, will have for 2020, 2021. So how do you plan that? And I think the key is, you know, we're in our case, you know, we're very lucky to have a very, very strong partner in Ethiopia. You know, how do you manage that? Sorry, how do you manage that from a roaster point of view? Make sure that you have an importing partner that has a very, very strong relationship in the countries your keys, because, you know, if you don't, then 21 is going to be very, very difficult. You know, your decisions are gonna have to be made delayed. They're gonna have to be made in your roastery. Perhaps you've been used to having, you know, a lot of your purchase decisions, you know, the hard yards done by the importer. As a roaster, you know, if that relationship isn't quite on point, you're going to have to be making those decisions. You know, you're going to have to be cupping the coffee to say yes or no. And, you know, that's a big call. So again, you know, you've got to be making sure that your relationships at origin, whether that's your direct trade relationships or the relationships you have through an importer, are really locked down and really solid. You know, that's the biggest one. And then obviously, you know, as part of that, making sure that you're forecasting, you know, that you're continuing to reach out on Zoom, you know, and you've got someone that can make you, you know, help make that happen.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Sure. Well, sweet. If I guess now would be a good time for me to take over and just kind of show you guys how this can be. We're going to skip through that and just kind of show how can Cropster help with making some of these buying decisions that we're talking about. So, you know, thinking about what is actually happening, and now diving into, it's not just what's the important things of knowing, you know, what's happening on a macro scale, you know, what's happening in Colombia, what's happening in Africa, what's happening in Brazil, but also, you know, what's happening in my roastery, and doing that forecasting work. And so how can Cropster help with that? So one of the things that's really helpful is this production report that is basically, it takes all of your roasting and it gives you a summary of your production. And we can see that, you know, I'm gonna turn on this pointer. We can see that up in the corner. You know, you see how much have you produced in the given date range. You know, how many batches was that? What's the total in batches per week? And then you can see what the percentage of is compared to the previous period. So, you know, sadly during COVID, a lot of that would have been a negative number, you know, down 20% from the previous period. But, you know, that's also a really important number to know. If you're using 20% less coffee, that means you need to be working with your importer to be updating your numbers, to be purchasing the right amount of coffee so you don't, you know, overstock. Then down here, you can see just a total of your green inventory used, which tells you, you know, okay, I'm going through this much coffee, and we can see, you know, what does that look like per machine, you know, which is helpful for planning out your maintenance on machines, as well as you can see by roast techs. And basically, you know, this is something that Cropster can generate for you, but it's also something, these are like the type of information that you need to be creating. And so whether that's with Cropster, or whether that is, you know, putting something together on your own, really having these types of numbers is the name of the game. And the cool thing is you can come down here and you can see, like, one of the things you need to be looking at is your offerings, you know? So you can look at that by profile and see, you know, what am I selling most of? What people are transitioning to drinking more coffee at home, and they're not just, you know, oh, I'll get whatever's on filter, or I'll just get a flat white, they're thinking like, oh, what coffee should I buy? So looking at, what is my product mix and what am I actually going through? And then for this, what we're talking about, looking through how are you selling your green inventory? You can come down here and you can see what's the green inventory, what's the name of it, what's the current amount of green that you've gone through, what was the tendency of that compared to the previous period. So again, seeing, how am I doing over time? Not just currently, but is that going up? Is that going down? You can actually look at this by location. So, if you had 2 roasteries, you could create a location for each roastery. And then you can see the amount that you're going through per week, the number of batches per week, which you could also set to per month or per day, and then your current inventory. So what's really important for this is, having these numbers available to you, is seeing like, okay, my current inventory, this is what I have at my roastery, is 1,934 kilograms. I'm doing 41 batches per week right now, and I'm going through 1,479 kilograms per week. So this tells me I'm gonna run out in a little bit over a week and a half, or a week and a third of a week. So when you're thinking about how much coffee do I need to get into my roastery, whether that's from my warehouse or whether I need to be calling up my importer and seeing, I need to get some more coffee lined up, then having these numbers and having a production report like the one that Cropster produces for you is super helpful for making those planning decisions. The other thing is having a good overview of your green inventory. So this is Cropster's green inventory report, and this just gives you a snapshot view of what is currently in your inventory. So we can see, these are the different lots, and this is how much is currently in inventory. And if we come down, sorry, this number is a little small, but we can see the initial weight of when you first brought it into your roastery, the current weight in bags, so you can actually store that in whatever way you want. So if it's 69 kilo bags, you can actually track that as that way. But then I think a really important thing that for roasters to be keeping track of is the price. So this La Loma, you brought in at 435 USD per pound. And so based on how much current inventory you have, you currently have 6,802 US dollars that are in green coffee. And so thinking about, what's my liquidity as a roaster? How fast can I turn this green coffee into $1 in my bank account so that I can be paying rent, so that I can be paying my employees, so that I can be paying all this? And then also knowing, how much coffee do I have or how much money do I have wrapped up in coffee right now? A really cool thing is part of what you can do in Cropster is create different locations. So what some people will do is they'll create a location for their roastery or warehouse, and then they'll also create a location for contracted coffee. And then you can add coffee as your contracted coffee that, maybe you've talked to Oliver and said, hey, I want to get Colombia lined up. And so then you line up, 6 different bags of Colombia, and you can create that as coffee as a coffee in a contracted location. That way you're thinking, already, how much coffee do I have contracted out and where's my money tied up? And then this little graph, you can see, if you click on this button over here, it brings up a graph, which is important for seeing, how have I used this coffee over time? So, we see based on, how you roast this coffee and how you go through that coffee, it'll tell you and give you a projected run out date of based on how you've used this coffee, this is when you're projected to run out. And it just picks that up. So, maybe this little flat line was 2 weeks vacation that you took off during COVID. But the important thing is thinking about, it's not just what's in my roast, how much green coffee is in my roastery, but when's it going to leave? And based on how I roast, how fast am I going through this coffee? And so that you can line up those next lots to fill the gap. And then a last thing that we were talking about is sample management. So even more important now than ever, is managing your samples. So the coffees that aren't currently in your inventory, but you're hoping to bring in, because really planning your product mix, not just and seeing, you know, okay, do I have an Africa? Do I have a few Central Americas? What do my customers want to buy? What do they want to brew in their own homes? And what's actually selling on my web shop? I think that's where a lot of really awesome web shop solutions now will tell you, you know, what you're selling the most of, and give some really good reports on that. And then you can take that information and go, okay, hey Oliver, send me some samples of whatever Ethiopia you have, and then you can enter those in. And there's some really important information. Hub, actually, we'll give it a quick shout out. Hub is a platform that Cropster has for where producers will list coffees that they have available, and you can request samples through it. So right now, while shipping is limited and while spot is tough to get a hold of, you can go on Hub and you can look for origin. You can look for where is this coffee currently being stored. So you can look for coffees that are stored in country. You can look for what their flavor profile is, and does that match, you know, maybe you're trying to find a coffee to fill in a spot in your current blend or in your current product mix, you know, looking up those. And so you can request samples through Hub, and importers will, wrong one. Importers will send those to you. And then also, you know, tracking these samples as a different type. So, you know, a coffee from when it's at the mill is potentially going to taste different than when it arrives in port. And as you're building those contracts out, you know, say like making sure that you're purchasing the coffee that you planned on purchasing is really important. So that's where Cropster, you know, has sample management, which allows you to accept and decline samples at each stage, as well as keep track of all this traceability info, like container number, as well as Cropster attaches all your cupping and physical analysis to your samples. And so with that, it just helps kind of keep everything in one place, so you can always be looking at that, and which helps you make the best decision. And then also, as I mentioned down here, looking at, you know, what's the expected rate of this coffee, what's the expected price of this coffee, and then, you know, what can I expect to be paying once we land and decide, you know, this is the coffee that we're going to be purchasing. And so planning your production, planning your money so that it's in the right place at the right time is all super essential. And those are just a few ways that Cropster can help with some of the stuff we've talked about today, so that you can have a better production line and be a better roaster. So that comes to the end of the content we wanted to hit, and we're hitting it just at 10 o'clock my time, which is 3 p.m. Sydney time. So if I want to check just to make sure if there are any questions currently in the chat. Cool, there are a couple questions. So I'll read those out, we'll hit them, and then we'll probably just see what else comes up, and then we'll head out. So Luke said, how do you suggest you calibrate your profiles with your importer/purchaser of choice? Is a great question. So Oliver, I'll leave that one off to you. Calibrating your profiles with your importer.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think, you know, again, now more than ever, you know, people need to be making decisions quickly. You know, you need to make sure you get it right with your samples. We're lucky. We've got a lot of people using Akawas here in Australia, which makes it really easy to share a profile on. And we've sort of built profiles for most of our most of our coffees. So, you know, sharing a profile, you know, just for the samples is very straightforward. And then obviously all of our sample roast is done on little drum roasters, the old Probats. And again, we're tracking all our roast profiles through Cropster. So, you know, we can share those. How useful they are for production roast is bit of a question mark. I think everyone's roast is different. You know, so I don't know, but yeah, I think it's really it's been a big one for us. Sort of making sure that we can flick roast profiles over, that we're calibrated as well on not just roast profiles but flavor profiles. You know, I think that's really key. I had or we had a customer also up in Queensland who, you know, when I was in the Sydney lab, I used to do a lot of the cupping notes and the calibration. Since I've moved down to Adelaide, the Harry and Eli in our lab are doing a lot of the roast profiling calibration for cup profiles. And flavor profiles. So that's changed slightly, and I know it's taken a while for us in that roaster to sort of rework what our fruit is and what our what our light roast is. So it's something you know, again, it comes back to this thing of being in constant conversation. I think now more than ever we've got to pick up the phone and or reach out on Zoom or whatever, and make sure you're sort of feeding back to your importers and talking to your roasts.
Also, sending your importers coffee, I'm sure, is gladly appreciated, because then they can tell exactly what you're trying to go for. But I think just like, again, the importance of having, like, that's one of the benefits of Cropster, is being able to keep all of your cupping notes and all of your data together. So that you can then go to your importer and say, hey, I'm running low on this Peru that's an essential part of my filter, that has these flavor notes, and so I need to know, I'm probably going to be running out in 2 months. Is there a spot offering that you have that's going to be filling this flavor note, or is there a coffee that we can contract this out for? And that's where really just being in communication, I think, is the most important, but also having good data that you can show, or that you can communicate to your importer on, like, hey, this is what I'm looking for. And then the more you work with an importer, the more they know, oh, okay, this is kind of the coffees that he's going for. These are the flavor notes that he's going for. And this is something that's probably going to be that she's going to be a big fan of, and she'll love, and so I can send her this coffee, or I can send him or them this coffee. And so I think that's really would be the key to that. Keith Klein asked, is there a way to look at the weekly average over a month in a production report? The answer is yes, I think. Basically, you can look at, what is the amount per week, and you can choose that data range as being, over the course of a month. That way you can be seeing, your production, and then because you're choosing the period, it'll tell you that tendency compared to the previous period, which if you're setting that as a week, it'll tell you, what that looks like as a week. I think that's what you're asking. If you want some more details, or an even deeper, demo going through that, we can 100% put that up. But I think that is the question. Is there any other questions that we've got? Or I think one of the ones that I was kind of thinking about is, in terms of contracting coffee for future years, that's kind of what we've been talking about as kind of the essential, thing for being a well prepared roaster for 2021. What would you say are, like, the two most important things maybe to think about or maybe the two, or what would be the best way, to get on your contracted coffee for the next couple years? Like, just chatting with you and getting those process started, or what's the takeaway that roasters need to be thinking about for buying coffee in 2020 and 2020?
It's a hard one. That's a really hard question, because it's so difficult to know what, like, you can do your projections of 2020. And considering they've been like up and down like a yo-yo, that's going to be hard because you don't know what 21 is going to look like. I think, given that cash flow is such a thing, it's such a big issue, and the cash to cash cycle. If you can be a bit more conservative, like say for example, you always contract a year, for a full year, maybe only contract by halves. Like 6 months, just in case you don't use as much as you're planning. I think the other thing is, within that 6 month, do be conservative in how you're going to use it. So, we'll definitely use 2 ton a week, 1 ton a week. Well, maybe dial that back to 600 kgs a week or whatever. I think be a bit conservative, but make sure you've had that conversation with your importing partner to be like, look, I thought I was going to do this originally without COVID. This is possibly with COVID, but can we talk about having some fat built in there so that you can support me if I do increase or not? And I think that's the key. Have those conversations. The other big thing is, know what your minimum or your roof price is going to be, and if you're in a position, almost give your importer a look. If this coffee hits this point, or if it's in this window, let's talk about buying. I think that's really key, because and again, it's a big if, but if the market is starting to go up, with your importer having the confidence to book coffee on your behalf, knowing that you're within a certain price window, and therefore you're going to be making money as the roaster. I think that's really important, like getting them to understand exactly what your needs are in terms of price and quality. And yeah, I know the other thing is exploring different ways of drawing on the coffee. Traditionally, people have either paid for a full box up front, or they pay a pallet and it's delivered. It could be interesting to explore other options, and not that I necessarily condone this to everyone and anyone, but for certain customers there have been opportunities where we've agreed a payment plan over a given period of time, and allowed them to take all the coffee in one go, which has saved us on storage, but also means that they can draw on it quickly. But their payments are clearly set out. There are no surprises. And that means they can plan their cash flow. And I think, again, if you've got an import partner that can help you with that, then, and of course, you've got to be lucky enough to have the space. But if those two things line up, then I think thinking a little bit differently along those lines would benefit, roasters for 21. But yeah, it's a really hard one because we just don't know what's going to happen.
Sure. And on that note, I think that's a perfect way to end talking about purchasing. We don't know what's going to happen, but the important thing is planning it out well, and giving yourself that lean, like you were talking about, that lean and that fat to where you need to grow. Say things, start opening up a ton, and you all of a sudden have a ton of demand from your cafes that you weren't expecting. Having that room to be able to draw on that, and be able to move when the market is moving. I think is really key. So we super appreciate all of you guys for joining us today, and girls, and non-binary friends, and everyone in between. But we thank you so much, and it's been super great. And if you want to get in more contact, get in touch with us about anything, other details about Condesa or about Cropster, feel free to reach out, and we'll share this slide with you so that you can also reference it too. That's it from me. Anything from you?
No. Other than thank you very much for organising this, and thank you everyone for being part of it. Yeah, it's good to be able to do it, and then, you know, hopefully we can sort of do more of this kind of thing.
Yeah. All right. Well, have a great rest of your Thursday.
Will do. Cheers, man.
Cheers, everyone.